In the frozen silence of the Arctic, a young woman exiled from her tribe builds an igloo alone, one ice block at a time, fighting to survive the endless winter. Watching from afar is a lonely Eskimo hunter who's lost his family and forgotten the warmth of companionship. Drawn by her determination, he offers help, not out of pity, but out of a growing admiration that melts the ice around his own heart. What begins as survival becomes a quiet, powerful story of love found in the coldest place on Earth. But what happens when her tribe discovers she's not only alive, but no longer alone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ivory necklace had been her grandmother's, passed down through 5 generations of women who understood the weight of tradition. Now it lay broken in the snow, its carved pieces scattered like her shattered life. The betrothal symbol snapped during the violent confrontation that sealed her fate. 3 days ago, Nayeli had been a respected member of the Taktu tribe, promised in marriage to Siku, the chief's son. The arrangement pleased everyone, her parents, the elders, even herself, for Siku was kind and strong. But kindness could not compete with the fire that burned in her chest when she looked at Nuka, the quiet hunter with gentle eyes who carved beautiful figures from driftwood and sang to the aurora at night. The discovery had been swift and merciless. Elder Kimmick found them together by the sacred ice caves, sharing stolen moments and whispered promises. Nuka's hands had been gentle on her face, his voice soft as he spoke of a future they both knew was impossible. The elders' shout shattered their fragile world, like spring ice under too much weight. "You bring shame upon your family," Kimmick had declared before the assembled tribe, his voice carrying across the settlement like winter wind. "You break sacred promises and dishonor the bonds that keep our people strong." Nayeli remembered the weight of every stare, the disappointment in her father's weathered face, the tears her mother tried to hide. Siku had stood silent, his jaw tight with humiliation and hurt. She had expected anger, demands for punishment, but his quiet dignity made her betrayal cut deeper. The tribal council's decision came swiftly: exile, not death. Their people were not cruel, but banishment to the wilderness until the spring thaw, when she might petition for return if she survived. It was considered mercy, though Nayeli wondered if a clean death might be kinder than the slow starvation and freezing that awaited her in the endless white expanse. Nuka had tried to follow, to share her punishment, but the warriors held him back. His anguished cries echoed across the ice as they led her away, her few possessions bundled in sealskin, her grandmother's broken necklace, the only reminder of who she had been before this moment, redefined her entire existence. They left her at the boundary stones, ancient markers that separated the known world from the killing wilderness beyond. Her father pressed dried fish into her hands, his own shaking with suppressed emotion. Her mother whispered prayers to Sedna, the sea goddess, begging protection for her daughter in the waste places where spirits grew hungry and ice never melted. Then they were gone, their figures disappearing into the grey distance like a mirage, leaving Nayeli alone with the wind and the terrible silence that pressed against her eardrums until she thought they might burst. The first night she huddled against a snowdrift, wrapped in her single sealskin blanket, watching the aurora dance overhead and wondering if she would live to see another. But as dawn painted the sky pale gold, something shifted inside her chest. The despair remained, heavy as winter clothing, but alongside it grew something harder, more determined. She would not die here in the snow like a discarded thing. She would survive. She would show them all, her tribe, the elders, even herself, that Nayeli, daughter of Uki, was stronger than their judgment. The first ice block she cut was clumsy, uneven, her inexperienced hands struggling with the bone knife her grandmother had hidden in her bundle. But it was hers, shaped by her will, the beginning of something that would shelter her from the killing cold. Each stroke of the blade was a declaration: "I will not surrender." I will not disappear quietly into the white silence. The work warmed her, gave purpose to muscles that wanted to curl up and wait for death. As she carved and shaped, memories of her grandmother's stories returned, tales of women who had survived impossible things, who had built lives from nothing but determination, and the knowledge passed down through generations of survivors. The broken necklace caught the sunlight as she worked, its scattered pieces glinting like stars fallen to earth. She gathered them carefully, tucking them into her pouch. Someday, perhaps, she would find a way to make them whole again. But first, she had to become whole herself, one ice block at a time. Casquet held the hunting spear with reverence, his calloused fingers tracing the 3 deep notches carved into its shaft. Each mark told a story written in grief. His wife Panuk, who died bringing their 2nd child into the world. Little Tuki, barely 2 winters old when the fever took him. And Neela, his daughter of 6 summers, who disappeared beneath the ice during the spring breakup when the frozen river betrayed her small footsteps. The spear had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that. The notches were his own addition, carved during the dark season that followed his losses, when the aurora seemed to mock him with its beauty, and the silence of his empty shelter became unbearable. Other men in the village remarked on his skill as a hunter, the way he could track caribou across vast distances and read weather patterns in the movement of clouds. They did not understand that hunting had become his escape from memory, the only activity that required enough concentration to silence the voices of the dead. For 3 years now, he had lived apart from the main settlement, preferring the solitude of the outer hunting grounds, where he could grieve without well-meaning interference. His shelter was simple but adequate, a traditional tent of sewn hides that could be erected quickly when following game, dismantled just as fast when the herds moved on. He owned little beyond necessities: tools, weapons, thick furs for warmth, and the growing collection of small carvings he made during long winter nights when sleep refused to come. The day he first saw the exile, Casquet had been tracking a wounded ptarmigan across the windswept plain. The bird's blood trail led him north of the usual hunting grounds, into territory that most avoided, too far from shelter, too exposed to sudden storms. He created a ridge, and there she was, a small figure against the vast whiteness, struggling with what appeared to be chunks of ice. At first, he thought she might be a spirit, one of the lost souls that wandered the waste places according to the old stories. But spirits did not leave breath clouds in the frigid air, did not stumble with exhaustion, did not curse in perfectly human frustration when a block of ice refused to cooperate. She was real, and she was alone, and she was attempting something that seemed both impossible and necessary. From his hidden position among the rocks, Casquet watched her work. Her movements were unpracticed but determined, her technique flawed but improving with each attempt. She was building something, shelter, he realized. An igloo, though her method bore little resemblance to the efficient construction he had learned as a boy. Still, there was something compelling about her persistence. The way she refused to surrender despite obvious inexperience and the growing lateness of the day. He should have approached immediately, should have offered help to someone so clearly in need, but something held him back. Perhaps the memory of how his own grief had made him value solitude, or recognition that she might have reasons for being alone that went deeper than mere circumstance. Instead, he found himself returning each day, drawn by curiosity and growing admiration for her stubborn refusal to quit. She was exiled, he concluded after several days of observation. The signs were unmistakable. The careful rationing of her meager supplies, the way she startled at distant sounds, the methodical approach that spoke of someone who knew this might be her only chance at survival. But from which tribe? And for what transgression? The questions multiplied even as his respect for her determination grew. In the evenings, when she huddled inside her partially completed shelter, Casquet would lie on his belly among the rocks and watch the small glow of her lamp through the ice walls. Sometimes he heard her voice, Not words he could distinguish, but the cadence of prayer or song, sounds that spoke of someone fighting to maintain hope against overwhelming odds. These moments affected him strangely, awakening feelings he had thought buried with his family. The hunting spear felt heavy in his hands as he wrestled with indecision. To approach would mean breaking the comfortable isolation that had protected him from further loss. To help would mean opening himself to caring about another person's survival, another person's pain. But to watch her struggle alone while he possessed knowledge that could save her life felt like a betrayal of everything. Decent, his father had taught him about responsibility to others. The 3 notches seemed to pulse under his thumb as he made his decision. Tomorrow he would find a way to help without revealing himself. It was a compromise that satisfied neither honor nor cowardice, but it was the most he could manage while his heart remained frozen in its protective shell of grief. The bone knife had been her grandmother's most treasured possession, passed down through generations of women who understood that survival often depended on the simplest tools wielded with skill and patience. Nayeli ran her thumb along its worn edge, feeling the smoothness that came from decades of careful use. When her mother had secretly slipped it into her exile bundle, the gesture had spoken louder than any farewell words. "Remember what grandmother taught you," her mother had whispered during those final moments. The ice speaks to those who listen. Each block has its own voice, its own purpose. You must learn to hear them. At the time, the words had seemed like the ramblings of grief, but now, crouched beside a promising section of wind-packed snow, Nayeli began to understand. The knife seemed to know where to cut, guiding her hands to places where the ice would split cleanly, rather than shatter into useless fragments. Each successful block felt like a small victory, a conversation between her desperate need and the frozen landscape's grudging cooperation. The work was harder than she had imagined. Her shoulders ached from the repetitive motion. Her hands cramped around the knife's handle despite the thick mittens that protected her from the worst of the cold. But with each block she extracted, her technique improved. She learned to read the subtle variations in the snow's surface, to identify the patches where wind and temperature had created the density needed for construction. Her grandmother's stories returned to her as she worked. Memories of winter evenings, when the old woman's voice would weave tales of survival and resourcefulness. Uki had been legendary among their people for her ability to thrive in the harshest conditions, to find food where others saw only barren ice, to create shelter that could withstand storms that flattened lesser constructions. The secret, Grandmother Uki had always said, is not to fight the cold, but to make it your ally. Ice wants to be shaped, wind wants to be channeled. You must listen to what they tell you and work with their nature, not against it. Now, alone in the wilderness, with only the bone knife and her fading memories for guidance, Nayeli found herself applying lessons she had only half understood as a child. She tested each potential cutting site by tapping gently with the knife's handle, listening for the subtle differences in sound that indicated density and strength. She observed how the wind carved natural patterns in the snow, using these formations to guide her placement of the foundation blocks. The first row was crooked, the blocks uneven and poorly fitted. But instead of discouragement, Nayeli felt a strange sense of accomplishment. She had created something from nothing, imposed her will upon the hostile environment that was supposed to claim her life. Each imperfect block represented a small rebellion against the fate her tribe had assigned her. As the day progressed, her movements became more fluid, more confident. The bone knife felt less foreign in her grip, more like an extension of her own determination. She began to anticipate how each piece would fit with its neighbors, adjusting her cutting technique to create better joints, smoother surfaces. The meditation-like rhythm of the work calmed her racing thoughts, focused her attention on the immediate task rather than the overwhelming uncertainty of her future. When hunger forced her to pause for a meager meal of dried fish, Nayeli studied her morning's progress with growing satisfaction. The foundation was small but solid, a rough circle barely large enough to shelter one person. But it was hers, built by her own hands, according to knowledge inherited from women who had faced similar trials and survived. The afternoon brought new challenges as she began the second row, learning how to angle the blocks inward to create the dome's distinctive shape. Several attempts collapsed, sending her carefully shaped ice tumbling back to the ground. Each failure stung, but she gathered the broken pieces and started again, adjusting her technique based on what each collapse had taught her. The bone knife caught the late sunlight as she worked, its surface gleaming with a warm light that seemed impossible in this frozen landscape. Her grandmother's spirit felt close in these moments, guiding her hands, whispering encouragement when frustration threatened to overwhelm her determination. The tool connected her not just to survival techniques, but to a lineage of strong women who had refused to surrender when faced with impossible odds. As evening approached and the temperature began its nightly plunge toward levels that could kill an exposed person within hours, Nayeli surveyed her progress with cautious optimism. The walls were taking shape, each row bringing her closer to the moment when she could seal herself safely inside her own creation. The wind arrived without warning, transforming the peaceful Arctic afternoon into a howling maelstrom that threatened to tear apart everything Nayeli had built. One moment she was carefully fitting another block into her slowly rising dome. The next she was pressed flat against the ice as hurricane-force gusts screamed overhead, carrying stinging particles of snow that felt like needles against any exposed skin. Her half-completed igloo shuddered under the assault, and she watched in horror as several of her carefully shaped blocks shifted and cracked under the pressure. The entrance she had been forming gaped like a wound, allowing the wind to funnel inside and create a vortex that threatened to tear the entire structure apart from within. Panic clawed at her throat as she realized how exposed she was. The storm had materialized from clear skies with the supernatural speed that made Arctic weather so deadly. Already, visibility had dropped to mere feet as swirling snow created a white wall that erased the familiar landmarks she used for navigation. If her shelter collapsed completely, she would have nowhere to retreat. No protection from winds that could freeze a person solid within hours. But even as terror flooded her system, her grandmother's training asserted itself. Panic kills faster than cold, the old woman had always said. When the world turns against you, think before you act. Every problem has a solution if you can see it clearly. Crawling on hands and knees to avoid the worst of the wind, Nayeli gathered loose blocks and began creating a makeshift barrier across the igloo's entrance. The chunks of ice were heavy and awkward to maneuver, but she wedged them together with desperate efficiency, using smaller fragments to fill the gaps. The wind howled its frustration as she gradually sealed off its pathway into her shelter. Inside the partial dome, the noise diminished to a more manageable roar, but the structure continued to shake, and she could hear ominous creaking sounds as her imperfect construction was tested beyond its limits. Several areas where blocks met showed dangerous gaps, and cold air whistled through these openings with enough force to create dangerous drafts. Working by the dim light that filtered through the ice walls, Nayeli began reinforcing the weakest points. She used snow mixed with precious drops of water from her dwindling supply to create a paste that could seal small gaps. For larger problems, she repositioned blocks, sometimes having to completely rebuild sections that had been compromised by the storm's fury. The makeshift wind barrier she had constructed from salvaged ice proved to be her salvation. What had begun as a desperate attempt to block the entrance evolved into a crude but effective airlock that broke the wind's direct assault on her shelter. The barrier wasn't beautiful, chunks of different-sized ice wedged together with no attention to aesthetics, but it held. And that was all that mattered. Hours passed as the storm raged outside. Nayeli huddled in her incomplete dome, making constant small adjustments to maintain its integrity. She learned to read the building's moods, to recognize which creaks were normal settling and which indicated imminent collapse. When one section began to sag dangerously, she propped it up with her walking stick, redistributing the load until the ice could bear its own weight again. Outside, hidden among the rocks that provided his usual vantage point, Caskai fought his own battle against the storm. He had watched the tempest's approach with growing alarm, recognizing the signs of a weather system that could kill even experienced travelers caught unprepared. Every instinct screamed at him to rush down the slope and help the struggling exile, to add his knowledge and strength to her desperate fight for survival. But something held him back, perhaps respect for her obvious determination to succeed on her own terms, or recognition that his sudden appearance during a crisis might be more harmful than helpful. Instead, he remained in his inadequate shelter, watching the dim glow that emanated from her igloo and praying to whatever spirits might be listening that her improvised construction would prove strong enough. As dawn finally broke over a landscape scoured clean by the storm's passage, Nayeli emerged from her shelter to assess the damage. Her igloo had survived, though it bore scars from the night's ordeal. The makeshift wind barrier lay partially collapsed, its purpose fulfilled, its crude construction somehow more beautiful to her eyes than the finest carved artwork. She had faced the Arctic's fury and won, not through superior skill or perfect technique, but through stubborn refusal to surrender and the willingness to improvise when elegant solutions proved inadequate. The barrier represented more than just survival. It was proof that determination and resourcefulness could overcome even the most desperate circumstances. The fish were fresh, their scales still bright with the silver sheen that faded quickly after death. Nayeli stared at them in bewilderment, counting and recounting the neat arrangement beside her igloo's entrance. 7 Arctic char, each one caught with skill and cleaned with practiced precision, laid out on a bed of clean snow like an offering to hungry spirits. She had awakened to find them there, placed sometime during the night while she slept exhausted from her battle with the storm. No footprints marked the snow around her shelter. The wind had scoured the ground clean, but someone had been here. Someone who moved with the silent skill of an experienced hunter and possessed enough generosity to share precious food with a stranger. Her first reaction was suspicion, tinged with fear. Who watched her closely enough to know her needs? What did they want in return for this unexpected kindness? In her tribe, gifts always carried obligations, debts that would eventually require repayment. But as her stomach cramped with hunger, practical concerns overwhelmed caution. The fish were real, they were fresh, and she was slowly starving on her dwindling supplies of dried meat and hard biscuits. The mysterious cache represented more food than she had seen since her exile began. Each fish was substantial, thick with the fat that Arctic-dwelling creatures needed to survive the crushing cold. Prepared properly, they could sustain her for days, providing not just calories, but the oils her body craved to maintain warmth in the endless winter. Whoever had left them understood exactly what kind of help she needed most. Still, she hesitated before gathering the gift. Accepting charity felt like admitting weakness, acknowledging that her proud determination to survive alone was failing. The fish seemed to mock her efforts at self-sufficiency, suggesting that she was nothing more than another desperate exile dependent on the pity of others. But even as pride warred with pragmatism, her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. Only fools refuse help when survival is at stake. Nayeli gathered the fish carefully, examining each one for signs of trap or trickery. But they were exactly what they appeared to be. Fresh-caught char, cleaned but not yet frozen solid, their flesh firm and sweet-smelling. No poison, no hidden hooks, no subtle cruelty disguised as kindness. Someone had simply seen her need and responded with anonymous generosity. As she prepared the first fish over her small oil lamp, she found herself studying the surrounding landscape with new awareness. Somewhere out there, a skilled hunter moved through terrain she was only beginning to understand. Someone who could approach her shelter undetected, who knew enough about her situation to provide exactly the right kind of assistance. who possessed both the ability and inclination to help a solitary exile survive another day. The fish cooked slowly, filling her small shelter with the rich scent of protein and fat. As she ate, Nayeli tried to reconstruct the previous night's events. She had fallen asleep shortly after the storm passed, exhausted by hours of constant vigilance as wind tested her shelter's weak points. Had her mysterious benefactor watched the entire ordeal? Had they seen her desperate improvisation with the wind barrier, her stubborn refusal to abandon her inadequate construction? The thought that someone had witnessed her struggle without interfering brought conflicting emotions. Part of her felt grateful for the restraint. She had needed to prove to herself that she could survive the storm's challenge. But another part wondered what kind of person could watch another's desperate fight without offering immediate help. Were they cruel, cautious, or perhaps wise enough to understand that some victories must be earned alone? Over the following days, more gifts appeared. Never when she was watching, always placed with the same careful discretion that left no traces of the giver's identity. Fish mostly, but also seal fat that burned cleanly in her lamp, and once a handful of dried berries that must have been precious beyond measure in this frozen wasteland. Each gift was exactly calibrated to her needs, suggesting observation so careful it bordered on intimate knowledge. Of her daily routines, she began leaving. Her own small offerings in response, a carved bone needle she had made during long hours of shelter-bound tedium, a portion of her own catch from the breathing holes she had learned to find in the ice. The gifts always disappeared by morning, replaced by new tokens of her guardian's continued vigilance. A conversation was developing between them, conducted entirely through the exchange of necessary things, building trust one careful gesture at a time. The keystone block was perfect, smoothly cut, precisely angled, its surface gleaming like polished jade in the afternoon light. Nayeli held it carefully, feeling its weight and balance, knowing that this single piece would determine whether her weeks of labor would succeed or collapse into frozen ruin. This was the moment her grandmother had described in countless stories, when skill and determination would either crown her achievement or reveal the flaws that made completion impossible. She had reached the midpoint of her igloo's construction, the critical juncture where amateur builders often failed. The dome's curve was becoming steeper now, each new row requiring greater precision as the blocks leaned inward toward their eventual meeting point at the structure's apex. One poorly fitted piece at this stage could destabilize everything below it, creating cascading failures that would bring down the entire edifice. As she positioned herself beneath the growing dome, preparing to lift the keystone into place, memories of happier times flooded back unbidden. She remembered the summer festivals when her tribe gathered to celebrate successful hunts and abundant fish runs. Children would chase each other between the tents, while elders shared stories and young people danced to drum beats that echoed across the tundra until dawn. She had been part of that community once, woven into its fabric so completely that she never questioned her place within it. The betrayal still burned in her chest, not just her own actions that led to exile, but the realization of how fragile her belonging had actually been. One forbidden love, one moment of weakness, and everything she had believed permanent dissolved like spring ice under warm wind. The faces of her family haunted her as she worked. Her father's disappointed silence, her mother's hidden tears. The way former friends had turned away when she passed as if exile might be contagious. But perhaps most painful was the memory of Nuka himself, the quiet hunter whose gentle touch had seemed worth any risk. In the euphoria of discovery, they had believed their love could overcome tribal law, that their feelings justified breaking sacred promises. Now, alone in the wilderness, with only wind for companionship, she understood how naive such thinking had been. Love was not enough to feed the hungry or shelter the homeless. Passion could not replace the complex web of obligations and traditions that kept their people alive in this hostile environment. The keystone settled into place with a soft scraping sound, its edges aligning perfectly with the blocks that surrounded it. For a moment, Nayeli held her breath, waiting to see if her construction would hold. The dome trembled slightly as the weight redistributed itself through the interlocking pieces, then settled into stable equilibrium. She had done it, reached the halfway point in her desperate project, proven that her grandmother's teachings could sustain life even in the hands of an inexperienced exile. Standing back to admire her progress, she felt a complex mixture of pride and sorrow. The igloo was becoming real, its curved walls rising like hope made solid from the unforgiving ice. But its very existence emphasized her isolation, marking her as someone who needed to build shelter rather than share the communal warmth that had once been her birthright. This was not the life she had imagined for herself during those carefree summers when the future seemed as boundless as the sky. Yet there was satisfaction in the work itself, a deep pleasure in seeing her vision take physical form through the patient application of skill and will. Each block represented a small victory over the environment that was supposed to claim her life. The perfectly fitted keystone proved that she was learning, growing stronger, becoming someone who could survive where others might perish. Perhaps exile was not just punishment but transformation, a crucible that would forge her into something tougher than the protected daughter she had once been. The afternoon light slanted through gaps in her construction, creating patterns of gold and shadow on the snow within. Soon those gaps would be sealed, the dome completed, and she would have created her own world within the larger wilderness. It would be small and simple, but it would be entirely hers, built by her hands, sustained by her determination. Proof that even the broken could learn to build something whole. As evening approached and the temperature began its nightly descent toward levels that could kill the unprepared, Nayeli gathered her tools and prepared for another night of careful vigilance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she worked toward completion. But tonight, she could rest knowing that the hardest part was behind her. The carved bonefish hook lay beside the morning's gift of seal fat, its surface polished to ivory smoothness by countless hours of handling. Unlike the anonymous offerings that had appeared each day, this tool carried the unmistakable marks of personal craftsmanship, tiny notches along its curve, decorative lines etched near the eye, the kind of careful ornamentation that spoke of long winter evenings spent perfecting functional art. Nayeli picked up the hook with trembling fingers, understanding immediately that this was different from the previous gifts. This was not just charity from a distant observer, but something intimate, personal, a piece of someone's life offered as an invitation to deeper connection. The bone was warm from her touch, and she could almost feel the presence of hands that had shaped it, used it, treasured it enough to part with it for her sake. She was examining the hook's intricate carvings when movement caught her peripheral vision. A figure emerged from behind the rocky outcropping that had concealed him for so many days, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the Arctic wilderness. He was tall and lean, his dark hair streaked with premature silver, his weathered face bearing the marks of someone who had known both joy and profound sorrow. They faced each other across 20 feet of wind-scoured snow, neither speaking, both acutely aware that this moment changed everything between them. The mysterious benefactor had a face now, a physical presence that transformed weeks of speculation into immediate reality. He stood with careful stillness, hands visible and empty, posture suggesting readiness to retreat if his presence proved unwelcome. Nayeli found her voice first, though it came out as little more than a whisper carried on the morning breeze. "You left these things," he nodded slowly, his dark eyes never leaving her face. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than she had expected, roughened by years of Arctic wind, but gentle in its careful cadence. "You needed help. I had help to give." The simplicity of his explanation struck her as profoundly honest. No elaborate justifications or self-serving explanations, just acknowledgement of need met by capability. She held up the fishhook, noting how the bone caught the light and threw back small rainbows. "This is yours. It has been used often. My father made it. His father before him." He took a small step closer, testing her reaction to his approach. "It has caught many fish, fed many families. Now it can feed you." The weight of that gift settled over her like a heavy blanket. This was not surplus possessions casually discarded, but a family heirloom passed down through generations, imbued with the memories and successes of his ancestors. To give it away represented either desperate generosity or something deeper, trust perhaps, or recognition of connection that transcended mere charity. "I cannot accept something so precious," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she knew she was lying to both of them. She was desperately alone, slowly starving despite his gifts, completely dependent on skills she was still learning. The hook represented not just sustenance, but survival itself. "You have already accepted it," he replied, with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "The bone remembers your touch now. It would be unhappy returned to hands that no longer need its service." They stood in silence for long moments, each taking the measure of the other. Nayeli saw competence in the way he held himself, comfort with solitude that matched her own forced isolation, and something else. A careful sadness that suggested he understood loss intimately. His clothing was well made, but showed signs of long use, patched and repatched, with the meticulous care of someone who wasted nothing. He saw determination in her stance, despite obvious exhaustion, pride that had not been broken by weeks of desperate survival, and the kind of stubborn courage that refused to surrender even when surrendering would be easier. Her half-completed igloo rose behind her like a monument to persistence, each imperfect block testifying to will stronger than circumstance. "I am Caskai," he said finally, offering his name like another gift, Nayeli. She hesitated, then added, "I am exiled from the Taktu people." He nodded, as if this confirmed something he had already guessed. "I have no people now. We are both alone in the cold places." The wind picked up, swirling snow between them like a visible reminder of the harsh world they both inhabited. But somehow its bite felt less sharp now that loneliness had been acknowledged, shared, transformed from individual burden into common ground for whatever relationship might grow between them. The double-handled snow shovel was unlike anything Nayeli had ever seen, its carved bone grips worn smooth by generations of cooperative use. Caskai demonstrated its purpose by taking one handle while gesturing for her to grasp the other, their movements synchronized as they lifted and moved blocks of ice that would have been impossible for either to manage. "Alone, my grandfather's design," he explained as they worked. Together, to position a particularly heavy section near the igloo's apex. He said the strongest tools require two people to reach their full purpose. The wisdom embedded in that simple observation struck Nayeli as profound. For weeks she had struggled alone, accepting that limitation as part of her punishment, never imagining that some tasks were meant to be shared. Now, with Cascai's experienced hands guiding their coordinated efforts, she discovered how much more could be accomplished through cooperation than individual determination. Their different skills complemented each other perfectly. He brought decades of knowledge about ice construction, understanding instinctively which blocks would bear weight, and how to angle pieces for maximum stability. She contributed fresh perspective and careful attention to detail, catching small imperfections that might have compromised the structure's integrity. Together, they created something stronger than either could have built alone. The work progressed with surprising speed. Sections that would have taken Nayeli days to complete took only hours when approached with combined knowledge and shared labor. Caskai showed her techniques passed down through generations of Arctic builders, how to read the grain of wind-packed snow, how to create joints so tight they seemed to grow together naturally, how to anticipate settling and adjust the construction to accommodate the ice's natural movement. But beyond the practical instruction, Nayeli found herself studying her companion with growing curiosity. He moved with the fluid economy of someone completely at home in this harsh environment, wasting no motion, every gesture purposeful and precise. Yet beneath that competence, she sensed careful restraint, as if he held himself back from full engagement with the world around him during breaks in their labor, when they shared portions of dried fish and hot tea brewed over her small oil lamp. She caught glimpses of the man beneath the skilled surface. He spoke little, but his words carried weight, chosen carefully and delivered with thoughtful consideration. When he looked at her work, really looked, with the attention of someone evaluating craftsmanship, she saw approval that warmed her more than the tea. "You learn quickly," he observed, as they fitted the final blocks of the dome's main structure. "Your grandmother taught you well, even if she could not teach you everything." The comment surprised her. "How do you know about my grandmother?" "The way you hold tools, the patterns you choose for cutting blocks. Knowledge passes down through generations, and yours came through women who understood ice." He paused in his work to study her face. "She was Uki of the Taktu, yes? Her reputation reached even isolated hunters like myself." Nayeli felt tears threaten at the unexpected honor paid to her grandmother's memory. In her exile, she had begun to doubt whether the old knowledge had any value, whether her grandmother's teachings were sufficient for survival in the real world. To hear them validated by someone whose competence was so obvious felt like receiving a blessing from beyond the grave. The double-handled shovel required them to work in close proximity, their movements becoming more coordinated as the day progressed. She began to anticipate his gestures, adjusting her position to make their shared lifting more efficient. He, in turn, moderated his pace to match hers, never pushing faster than she could comfortably follow. The partnership felt natural despite their recent acquaintance, as if they had been working together for years rather than hours. As evening approached and the last blocks were positioned to complete the igloo's basic structure, Nayeli stepped back to survey what they had accomplished. The dome rose from the frozen ground like a monument to cooperation, its smooth curves reflecting the day's fading light. What had begun as her desperate solo project had become something larger, proof that even exiles could find partnership. That isolation was not necessarily permanent. Cascai began gathering his tools with the methodical care she was learning to associate with all his actions. She watched him prepare to leave and felt something close to panic at the thought of returning to solitude after experiencing the warmth of shared purpose. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked, trying to keep desperation from her voice. He paused in his packing, considering her request with the same careful attention he gave everything else. Finally, he nodded toward the completed igloo. "There is still work to be done. Interior fitting, ventilation, proper entrance. Yes, I will return." The storytelling stones lay between them in a careful circle, each smooth piece of carved soapstone representing a different chapter in the ancient tales that connected their people across generations. Cascai had arranged them with ceremonial precision on the fur spread across the igloo's floor, the small oil lamp casting dancing shadows that brought the carved figures to life in the flickering light. "This is how my father taught me," he said, his voice taking on the ritual cadence of formal storytelling. "Each stone holds memory. Together they tell the stories that keep us human in the long darkness." Nayeli recognized the tradition, though her own tribe used different objects for the same purpose. The stones were beautiful, worn smooth by countless tellings, their surfaces etched with symbols that seemed to shift and change in the lamplight. She watched Cascai's weathered hands hover over them, selecting pieces with the reverence others might reserve for sacred objects. "This one speaks of the time before," he began, lifting a stone carved with figures of caribou and human hunters. "When the world was new and spirits walked openly among our people, when the first hunters learned to survive by watching the animals and learning their ways." As his voice filled the small space, Nayeli found herself drawn into stories she had never heard, tales that paralleled her own people's traditions while carrying their own unique wisdom. He spoke of the great migration that brought his ancestors to these frozen lands, of the negotiations with Sedna that allowed humans to take life from the sea, of the careful balance that must be maintained between taking and giving back. The completed igloo enclosed them in intimate warmth, its ice walls glowing with the lamp's soft radiance. Outside, wind moaned across the Arctic wasteland, but inside their shared shelter, the storm felt distant and manageable. Steam rose from the tea they shared, and the air carried the comfortable sense of burning oil and warm bodies finding refuge from the cold. When Casquet finished his stories, he gestured toward the stones with an invitation in his eyes. Your people have tales as well. The stones will hold new memories if you share them. Nayeli hesitated, then reached for a stone carved with the image of a woman's face. My grandmother told this one during the darkest nights, when children feared the spirits that hunt in winter's heart. Her voice found the storytelling rhythm, words flowing with the practiced ease of someone raised on oral tradition. She told of Aput, the wise woman who saved her village by bargaining with the aurora itself, trading her mortal sight for the ability to see paths through the spirit world. As she spoke, she watched Casquet's face, noting how his attention remained complete and respectful, how he nodded at familiar elements, while leaning forward during parts that were new to him. The exchange continued through the long evening, stories flowing between them like gifts freely given and gratefully received. He shared tales of great hunters and tragic loves, of spirits both helpful and dangerous, of the delicate relationships that governed life in the unforgiving Arctic. She responded with stories of her own people's heroes and cautionary tales, of the grandmother whose wisdom had shaped her childhood, of traditions that connected her to ancestors stretching back beyond memory. Through their storytelling, deeper truths emerged. Casquet spoke of his wife Panuk with gentle reverence, describing her skill at traditional crafts and the way she could calm frightened children with her voice. The pain in his words was evident but controlled, grief that had been acknowledged and accepted rather than fought against. When he mentioned his lost children, his voice remained steady. Though his hands stilled on the stones he held, Nayeli found herself sharing things she had never spoken aloud. Her complicated feelings about the arranged marriage she had been expected to accept, her guilt over the pain her choices had caused her family, her terror during the first nights of exile when death seemed both imminent and welcome. The words came easier in the formal context of storytelling, disguised as narrative rather than confession. Your nuka, Casquet said quietly, when she finished a tale that paralleled her own situation too closely to be coincidence. He was worth the risk you took? The question hung in the warm air between them, more personal than anything they had shared before. Nayeli considered her answer carefully, understanding that honesty here would set the tone for whatever relationship might develop between them. I thought so then, she said finally. Now I think perhaps I was young and confused love with defiance. Sometimes it takes losing everything to understand what truly matters. He nodded slowly, his dark eyes reflecting understanding rather than judgment. Wisdom comes at high cost, but it does come if we survive long enough to claim it. The traditional fishing net spread between them like a web of ancient knowledge, its sinew strands woven in patterns that had fed Arctic peoples for countless generations. Casquet's hands moved with practiced grace as he demonstrated the complex technique, his fingers dancing through motions learned at his father's side during long winter evenings when outside work was impossible. See how the knots must be uniform, he explained, guiding Nayeli's awkward fingers through the intricate process. Each one the same tension, the same spacing. Fish are clever. They will find any weakness and exploit it. Nayeli struggled with the unfamiliar movements, her cold, stiffened fingers fumbling with the thin strands of sinew. The work required patience she was still learning to cultivate, precision that came only through repetition, an understanding of principles that seemed simple until attempted. Each knot was a small puzzle, and the accumulation of hundreds of perfect knots would create a tool that could mean the difference between abundance and starvation. Your grandmother knew this craft, Caskai observed as he watched her gradually improve. The Taktu women were famous for their nets. Their fishing grounds fed many tribes during the Great Hunger Winters. The mention of her heritage brought both pride and sorrow. Nayeli remembered watching the skilled women of her tribe working with similar materials, their conversations flowing as easily as their practiced motions. She had been too young then to appreciate the complexity of what they were creating, too focused on the immediate concerns of childhood to understand that they were preserving knowledge essential for survival. "I should have paid better attention," she admitted, fighting frustration as another knot came out crooked. "I thought there would always be time to learn later, when I was older and ready to take on women's responsibilities." "Learning continues until death," Cascais replied gently. "What matters is that you learn now, when the knowledge can serve its purpose." As the hours passed, her technique gradually improved. The rhythm of the work became meditative, her hands finding their own wisdom as they repeated the ancient motions. Cascais proved to be a patient teacher, correcting her mistakes without criticism, offering encouragement when frustration threatened to overwhelm her determination. His teaching style reminded her of her grandmother, firm but kind, demanding excellence while acknowledging that mastery took time. The net grew slowly, each row adding to the complex pattern that would eventually trap fish below the ice. As they worked, Cascais shared stories of legendary catches, of years when the nets brought such abundance that entire communities could feast for weeks. He spoke of the ceremonies that preceded important fishing expeditions, the offerings made to Sedna to ensure her cooperation, the careful protocols that maintained harmony between humans and the sea's abundant life. "Fishing is not just about taking," he explained, as they paused to rest their cramped hands. "It is about relationship. The fish give themselves to those who show proper respect, who take only what is needed, who remember their obligations to future generations." Nayeli found herself thinking about relationships of all kinds as they returned to their work. The net represented connection, strands that were weak individually but strong when woven together, patterns that created purpose from scattered elements. Perhaps survival itself was like that, she thought. Not just individual determination, but the complex web of interdependence that sustained life in harsh places. Their conversation meandered through various topics as their hands maintained their steady rhythm. He told her about the seasonal migrations of different fish species, the subtle signs that indicated the best locations for setting nets, the patience required for this kind of hunting that could involve days of waiting for a single opportunity. She shared what she remembered of her tribe's fishing traditions, comparing techniques and discussing regional variations in approach. "Why do you share this knowledge with me?" she asked during one of their breaks, the question emerging from thoughts she had been carrying for days. "You owe me nothing. I'm exiled, cut off from the community that gave meaning to such skills." Cascais considered his answer carefully, his dark eyes studying the half-completed net between them. "Knowledge that is not shared dies with its keeper. My father taught me these things so they would continue beyond my lifetime. If I die alone in the wilderness, all of that learning dies with me." The practical explanation made sense, but Nayeli sensed deeper motivations in his willingness to teach. There was loneliness in his careful instruction, a hunger for connection that matched her own desperate need for human contact. Teaching created relationship, transformed strangers into partners in the essential work of staying alive. As evening approached and the net neared completion, she realized that more than fishing technique was being transmitted between them. Trust was growing with each shared hour, understanding deepening through the intimate process of learning and teaching. The carved. Walrus tusk was no larger than her thumb, but Cascais had transformed the ivory into something breathtaking, two figures standing close together. their forms simplified but unmistakably human, their postures suggesting protection and comfort. He worked on it during quiet moments, his knife moving with delicate precision as details emerged from the raw material like memories surfacing from deep water. Nayeli pretended not to watch as he carved, but her eyes were drawn repeatedly to the careful movements of his hands. There was tenderness in how he shaped the figures, an attention to detail that spoke of personal investment beyond mere craftsmanship. The female figure bore a subtle resemblance to her own proportions, while the male stood with the same quiet strength that characterized Casquet himself. "It is beautiful work," she said finally, abandoning the pretense of indifference. "Your hands know ivory well." He paused in his carving, considering whether to acknowledge what they both understood the piece represented. "My father taught me that idle hands in winter mean death in spring. Better to create something that serves the spirit when physical needs are met." The deflection was gentle but clear. He was not ready to discuss the deeper implications of his art, yet the evidence of his feelings lay between them, as tangible as the carved ivory itself. The figures leaned into each other with an intimacy that could not be accidental, their positioning suggesting relationship that went beyond mere companionship. They had been living in careful proximity for weeks now, sharing the igloo's warmth while maintaining the respectful distance of people still learning to trust. But that distance was shrinking with each passing day, worn away by shared labor, common meals, and the growing comfort they found in each other's presence. What had begun as mutual aid was transforming into something deeper, more complex, fraught with possibilities that neither dared name aloud. The change was visible in small gestures, the way he checked her hands for signs of frostbite without being asked, how she prepared tea the way he preferred without conscious thought, the manner in which they moved around each other in the confined space with an awareness that bordered on choreography. They were becoming attuned to each other's rhythms, needs, moods in ways that suggested emotional intimacy, developing alongside physical proximity. Yet both carried scars that made vulnerability dangerous. Nayeli's exile had taught her that love could destroy as easily as sustain, that following the heart's desires could lead to catastrophic loss. Casquet's grief remained visible in unguarded moments, a reminder that attachment brought the risk of devastating pain when death inevitably claimed those we cherish. "Sometimes I dream of my children," he said unexpectedly, his knife stilling against the ivory. "They are playing in summer sunshine, calling for me to join their games. I wake expecting to hear their voices, and the silence feels like dying all over again." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Nayeli felt honored by his trust, even as her heart ached for his loss. She understood now why he had lived alone for so long, why helping her had been such a significant decision. Opening himself to caring about another person's welfare meant risking the return of pain he had barely survived once. "I think they would want you to be happy," she said softly. "Children love their parents too much to wish them eternal loneliness." His dark eyes met hers across the lamp's flickering flame, and she saw tears he refused to shed. "Perhaps. But happiness feels like betrayal when it comes at the cost of forgetting. Who speaks of forgetting?" Nayeli leaned forward, her voice gaining strength. "Love does not require erasure of what came before. Hearts are not like shelters. They do not have limited space. They expand to hold whatever we ask of them." The words surprised her even as she spoke them. When had she become someone who offered wisdom about love's complexities? Perhaps exile had taught her things about the heart's resilience that she was only now beginning to understand. Loss and love could coexist. Memory and hope could share the same space without diminishing each other. Casquet resumed his carving, but his movements had changed, become more purposeful. The figures seemed to lean closer together under his guidance, their separate forms finding ways to support and shelter each other. When he finally looked up again, something had shifted in his expression, a lessening of the careful control that usually masked his deeper feelings. "The heart wants what it wants," he said quietly, "regardless of whether we think ourselves ready for its demands." Nacheli felt heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the lamp's flame. The acknowledgement hung between them like a bridge they could choose to cross or leave untraversed. The carved figures seemed to pulse with warm life in the dancing light. Two separate beings choosing connection over solitude, risk over safety, love over the easier isolation that protected but never fulfilled. The migration map spread across the snow outside their igloo like a constellation fallen to earth. Each mark carefully placed to indicate safe passages, reliable hunting grounds and seasonal shelters. Caskai traced the routes with his walking stick, explaining the complex timing that governed Arctic survival as winter slowly released its grip on the land. "The caribou move first," he said, pointing to a series of marks that formed a vast arc across the tundra, following ancient paths their ancestors carved through generations of migration. Where they go, other life follows. Wolves, birds, fish returning to spawning grounds. Naeli studied the intricate pattern, recognizing the careful observation required to create such detailed knowledge. This was not just a map, but a calendar, a prediction system, a survival guide that could mean the difference between abundance and starvation during the critical transition from winter to spring. That he was sharing it with her suggested plans that extended far beyond temporary cooperation. "And us?" she asked quietly. "Where do we fit in these patterns?" The question carried weight beyond its simple words. They had been living day to day, focused on immediate survival needs, but spring's approach demanded longer-term thinking. Soon the igloo would become impractical as temperatures rose and ice began to soften. Their current arrangement, comfortable as it had become, could not continue indefinitely without decisions about their shared future. Cascais knelt beside the map, his weathered hands hovering over markings that indicated summer fishing camps and seasonal settlements. "My family had traditional grounds near the Great Lake," he said slowly. "Shelters that could be rebuilt, cached supplies that might still be useful. We could go there, establish ourselves before the traveling season brings others to compete for the best locations." The casual "we" sent warmth through Naeli's chest despite the cold morning air. He was including her in his plans without forcing discussion of what their partnership might become, offering practical solutions while leaving emotional questions unresolved. It was a generous approach that respected her independence while acknowledging their growing interdependence. "The Taktu have summer camps in that region," she said carefully. "There could be complications if we encounter my people." "Perhaps." Cascais drew new lines in the snow, showing alternate routes that skirted traditional tribal territories. "But perhaps not." Exile was for winter survival. Spring brings new possibilities, new perspectives. People change when they see that the impossible has become possible. His optimism surprised her. She had grown accustomed to thinking of her banishment as permanent, a severing that could never be repaired. But looking at the migration map, seeing how all life moved through cycles of separation and reunion, she began to imagine different futures. Perhaps exile was not an ending, but a transformation. A winter that would eventually yield to its own spring. They spent the morning refining their plans, considering various scenarios and their appropriate responses. Cascais' knowledge of seasonal patterns was encyclopedic, accumulated through decades of careful observation and handed down from generations of successful survivors. He knew which valleys stayed warm longest, which rivers ran clearest, where game would be most abundant during different phases of the brief Arctic summer. "You have thought about this carefully," Naeli observed, as they marked potential campsites and supply caches. "Did you always plan to leave this place when spring came?" He paused in his drawing, considering how much truth to reveal. "I had no plans beyond surviving each day. But plans change when circumstances change. When solitude becomes partnership, different futures become possible. The admission hung between them like morning mist, delicate but substantial. He was telling her that his attachment to her had altered his entire approach to life, that what they had built together was precious enough to plan around, to protect, to nurture into something permanent. The realization brought both joy and terror, joy at being valued so highly, terror at the responsibility such devotion implied. "I want to try," she said simply. "Whatever we are becoming, whatever challenges we might face, I want to see where these paths lead." Casquet's smile transformed his weathered face, erasing years of careful control and revealing the man he had been before grief taught him to guard his emotions. "Then we plan for success rather than merely survival. We build something worth having rather than simply enduring what we cannot change." The migration map seemed to pulse with possibility as they continued their work, each mark representing not just geographical knowledge, but hope made concrete. They were designing their future together, creating a framework that could support whatever relationship might develop between them while providing practical structure for the challenges ahead. The warning signal fire climbed into the clear morning sky like a dark prayer, its column of smoke visible for miles across the flat expanse of snow-covered tundra. Gasquet had spotted the approaching figures while checking his snares, distant dots that moved with the purposeful formation of experienced travelers. His hands shook as he fed dried grass and seal fat to the flames, sending the urgent message that would give them precious minutes to prepare. Nayeli emerged from the igloo at his shouted warning, her face immediately understanding the implications of the rising smoke. She had always known this moment might come, had prepared herself mentally for the possibility that her survival would eventually reach her tribe's attention. But knowing and experiencing were different things entirely, and her stomach clenched with familiar fear as she scanned the horizon for signs of pursuit. "How many?" she asked, checking the knife at her belt with automatic movements learned during weeks of constant vigilance. 6, perhaps 7. Moving fast but not running. "They know where to find us." Casquet's voice remained steady, despite the tension radiating from his body. "They have been tracking for days, probably since the last storm cleared enough to follow our traces." The implications settled over them like a heavy blanket. Her tribe had not given up on her as completely as she had assumed. Whether their motivation was concern, duty, or something darker remained to be seen. But their presence meant that the careful isolation they had built together was about to be shattered by contact with the larger world. They worked together with efficient urgency, gathering essential supplies and preparing for whatever confrontation awaited them. Gasquet checked his weapons, while Nayeli secured their limited food stores and filled water containers from the ice they had been melting for daily use. Neither spoke of flight. They both understood that running would only delay the inevitable while making them appear guilty of whatever crimes her pursuers imagined. "You could leave," Nayeli said quietly as they watched the figures grow larger against the white landscape. "This is not your trouble. You owe my people nothing." Casquet turned from his study of the approaching party to look directly into her eyes. "Where you go, I go. What threatens you threatens me. This is what partnership means." The simple declaration carried more weight than elaborate promises. He was choosing to stand with her despite not knowing what charges might be brought, what punishments might be demanded, what consequences his loyalty might bring upon his own head. The decision spoke of commitment that went beyond convenience or temporary alliance. As the hunting party drew close enough for individual recognition, Nayeli's heart sank. Elder Kimmick led the group, his weathered face set in the expression of righteous determination she remembered from her trial. Behind him rode familiar figures from her childhood, her uncle Utu, the tracker Ceci, warriors she had known since birth, who now looked upon her with the careful neutrality of people performing an unpleasant duty. They arranged themselves in a formal semicircle facing the igloo, their sleds and dogs positioned to block any escape routes. The choreography was familiar from tribal justice ceremonies, designed to emphasize the authority of the group while minimizing the possibility of violence. Elder Kimmick dismounted with the careful dignity of age and approached until he stood within speaking distance. Nayeli, daughter of Uki, he called formally, his voice carrying across the space between them. You were given winter to prove your worthiness to live. The season turns towards spring, and we have come to see what manner of person emerges from the trial you were granted. The words carried no immediate threat, but neither did they offer forgiveness. This was evaluation, not rescue, and the outcome would depend entirely on how successfully she had transformed herself during the months of exile. Caskai moved to stand beside her, his presence a silent statement that she would not face judgment alone. I present myself as you see me, Nayeli replied with as much dignity as she could muster. Alive, capable, and no longer the foolish girl who broke faith with her people. Elder Kimmick's eyes moved between her and Caskai, taking note of their obvious partnership, the well-constructed shelter behind them, the evidence of successful survival that surrounded their small encampment. His expression remained unreadable, but she caught glimpses of surprise at finding her not just alive, but apparently thriving in circumstances that should have claimed her life. And this one? The elder asked, gesturing toward Caskai. What role does he play in your transformation? The question hung in the cold air, like the smoke from their warning fire, carrying implications that would determine whether their partnership could survive contact with the world they had left behind. Elder Kimmick's judgment staff caught the morning light, its carved whalebone surface bearing the symbols of traditional authority that had governed the Taktu people for generations beyond memory. The staff represented more than personal power. It embodied the collective wisdom of ancestors, the weight of cultural law, and the responsibility to make decisions that would preserve the tribe's survival in an unforgiving world. Nayeli faced the semicircle of her former people with steady composure, though her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Behind her stood Caskai, his presence both comfort and complication. The assembled warriors and elders studied them both with expressions that revealed nothing, their weathered faces masks of professional evaluation. You ask what role this man plays in my survival? Nayeli said, her voice carrying across the frozen ground with clear determination. He is Caskai of the northern hunting grounds, and he has shown me that exile need not mean death. That honor can exist even in the waste places where you sent me to die. A murmur ran through the assembled group at her directness. Elder Kimmick raised the judgment staff slightly, calling for silence while he considered her words. His eyes moved between the couple and their obviously successful encampment, taking note of details that spoke to competence, cooperation, and careful survival planning. I have heard this name, the elder said slowly. Caskai, the widowed hunter, whose family was taken by the great sickness 3 seasons past. You have wandered far from your people's territory. Caskai stepped forward, inclining his head with respectful acknowledgement of the elder's status. I go where the hunting leads me, honored one. But I stay where I find purpose worth preserving. The careful phrasing carried multiple meanings, all of which registered in the elder's intelligent eyes. This was not a casual encounter between wanderers, but something deeper, a partnership that had developed through shared trials and proven itself through successful survival in conditions that killed the unprepared. Show us this purpose, Elder Kimmick commanded, tapping his staff against the hard-packed snow. Demonstrate what manner of people emerge from winter's testing. It was the challenge Nayeli had both hoped for and dreaded. She looked at Caskai, seeing understanding pass between them without words. Together, they moved toward their igloo, gesturing for the tribal delegation to observe as they demonstrated the life they had built together. The interior of their shelter spoke eloquently of partnership. Tools arranged with shared purpose, food stores carefully managed for long-term survival, sleeping areas that provided privacy while acknowledging their growing intimacy. Everything showed the marks of 2 people who had learned to function as a coordinated unit while maintaining individual dignity and capability. Caskai demonstrated the fishing net they had constructed together. explaining techniques that could improve the tribe's winter food security. Nayeli showed innovations she had developed for ice construction, methods that created stronger shelters with less material. Together, they presented evidence of knowledge shared, skills enhanced, survival strategies that transcended what either could have achieved alone. The exiled girl we sent to die has become a woman who thrives, observed Utu, Nayeli's uncle, his voice carrying grudging admiration. And she has found a partner whose reputation for skill honors rather than shames our judgment. Elder Kimmick walked slowly around their encampment, his practiced eye cataloging evidence of successful adaptation. The judgment staff remained upright in his grip, but his posture had shifted from confrontational evaluation to something approaching respect. When he completed his circuit, he faced them both with an expression that revealed careful reconsideration of predetermined assumptions. "You were sent away to learn the cost of breaking sacred promises," he said to Nayeli. "What have you learned in this place of testing?" The question demanded honesty that went beyond mere survival skills. Nayeli gathered her thoughts carefully, understanding that her answer would determine not just her own fate, but Cascay's future as well. The judgment staff seemed to pulse with ancestral authority, demanding truth worthy of the sacrifices that had preserved their people through countless generations. "I learned that love without honor is destruction," she said finally. "That true partnership requires respect for obligations beyond personal desire. That survival means building something stronger than individual will." She paused, then added with quiet conviction, "And that exile can teach lessons worth bringing back to benefit the people who showed mercy by granting life instead of death." The words hung in the crystal air, carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. Elder Kimmick studied her face for long moments, then turned his attention to Cascay with equal intensity. "And you, wanderer, what would you add to these conclusions?" Cascay met the elder's gaze without flinching, that some partnerships are blessed by spirits who understand that isolated strength serves no one, that knowledge shared multiplies rather than diminishes, that your daughter has become someone worthy of the trials that shaped her. The ice sculpture rose from the snow like a frozen prayer, its crystalline surfaces catching and fracturing the afternoon light into countless rainbow fragments. Nayeli and Cascay worked together with fluid coordination, their tools moving in harmony as they shaped the massive block of clear ice into something that transcended mere craftsmanship and entered the realm of art that spoke to the soul. Elder Kimmick and the tribal delegation watched in growing amazement as the collaborative creation took form under their skilled hands. What had begun as a simple demonstration of winter survival techniques was evolving into something far more profound, a testament to the power of true partnership, the beauty that emerged when different skills merged in common purpose. "The foundation must be perfect," Cascay murmured as he shaped the sculpture's base, his knife moving with surgical precision through the resistant ice. "Everything else depends on this stability." Nayeli worked on the upper sections, her smaller hands perfect for the delicate detail work that brought their vision to life. Her grandmother's bone knife sang through the ice as she carved flowing lines that suggested movement frozen in time, patterns that echoed the aurora's dance across Arctic skies. Where their separate sections met, the joints were so seamless that the sculpture appeared to be carved from a single impossible block. The subject of their creation spoke volumes about their relationship. Two figures emerged from the ice, not standing apart but intertwined, supporting each other while maintaining individual strength and dignity. The female figure reached upward while the male provided steady foundation, but both contributed to the sculpture's overall stability and beauty. It was partnership made visible, cooperation transformed into art. "I have never seen ice worked with such skill," admitted Sessi the tracker, his professional eye appreciating techniques that went far beyond mere functional carving. This is master-level craftsmanship from both of them. The tribal observers began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Individual artisans might create beautiful works, but this collaboration produced results that neither could have achieved alone. The sculpture pulsed with life, despite being carved from frozen water, its surfaces reflecting light in ways that created the illusion of movement and breath. As the afternoon progressed, other elements were added to their demonstration. Cascais showed how their partnership had improved his hunting efficiency, while Nayeli demonstrated innovations in food preservation that could benefit the entire tribe. Everything they presented reinforced the same message. Their union strengthened rather than weakened their individual capabilities. They complement each other perfectly. Yutu observed quietly to Elder Kimmick. Her creativity balances his experience. His stability grounds her innovation. Together they create something neither could achieve alone. The elder nodded slowly, his evaluation shifting from skeptical assessment to genuine admiration. The judgment staff remained in his grip, but its weight seemed less oppressive now, more ceremonial than threatening. The evidence before him challenged preconceptions about exile and punishment, suggesting that sometimes the greatest lessons came through apparent loss rather than comfortable conformity. The ice sculpture neared completion as evening approached, its final details bringing the collaborative creation to vivid life. The intertwined figures seemed to breathe in the shifting light, their frozen forms suggesting eternal partnership, enduring love. Unbreakable bonds forged through shared trials and mutual respect. This is what we offer, Nayeli said as she set down her carving tools, addressing the assembled delegation with quiet dignity. Not just our individual skills, but our ability to work together in ways that multiply strength rather than divide it. We have learned to create beauty even in the harsh places, to find hope in circumstances that might destroy those who face them alone. Cascais added his tools to hers, the gesture symbolizing their unified presentation to her people. We ask not for charity, but for the chance to contribute. Our partnership has value beyond our personal happiness. It offers knowledge, techniques, perspectives that could strengthen the entire community. The sculpture stood between them and the tribal delegation like a crystalline ambassador, its beauty arguing more persuasively than words ever could. In its frozen perfection lay proof that their love was not destructive selfishness, but creative force, not weakness but strength multiplied through cooperation. Elder Kimmick approached the sculpture slowly, studying its details with the careful attention of someone trained to read meaning in traditional arts. His weathered fingers traced the intertwined figures, feeling the smooth transitions where separate hands had worked toward common vision. When he looked up, his expression had transformed from judgment to something approaching wonder. "You have created something worthy of the ancestors," he said softly. "Something that honors the old ways while showing new possibilities. This is not the work of people who have forgotten their obligations to community." The words carried more weight than formal pronouncement, suggesting acceptance that went beyond mere tolerance to active appreciation of what they had achieved together. The wedding ice crown gleamed like captured starlight, its delicate crystalline spires carved from sacred ice taken from the deepest part of the winter lake, where spirits were said to bless the water with their presence. Elder Kimmick's weathered hands trembled slightly as he lifted the ceremonial headpiece, its weight carrying the accumulated authority of countless generations who had sanctified unions under its gleaming arch. Nayeli knelt in the snow before the assembled tribe, her heart racing with emotions too complex to name. 3 moons ago, she had been an exile facing death in the wilderness, and now she prepared to receive the highest honor her people could bestow, acceptance not just as returning daughter, but as worthy partner in a union that would strengthen the community's bonds. The ice crown caught the aurora's light, fracturing it into countless rainbow fragments that danced across her upturned face. Cascais, of the northern hunting grounds, Elder Kimmick intoned with formal ceremony, Do you accept the obligations that bind a man to the Taktu people? Do you swear to share your knowledge, defend our interests, and honor the traditions that have preserved our survival through countless seasons of trial? Cascais stood tall beside Nayeli, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what was being offered. I swear by the spirits of my ancestors and the memory of my lost family that I will serve the Taktu people as faithfully as I would my own birth tribe. Your struggles become my struggles, your prosperity my joy, your survival my sacred duty. The oath resonated across the gathered crowd with the weight of solemn promise. Representatives from 6 different family groups had traveled considerable distances to witness this unprecedented ceremony, the first time in living memory that an exile had been not only forgiven but elevated through marriage to someone whose skills were actively desired by the community. Nayeli's parents stood among the witnesses, their faces showing complex mixtures of relief, pride, and lingering bewilderment at their daughter's transformation. Her mother clutched the repaired betrothal necklace, its broken pieces carefully rewoven with sinew dyed red to commemorate trials overcome. Her father held himself with the dignified bearing of someone whose shame had been transformed into unexpected honor. Nayeli, daughter of Uki, the elder continued, turning his attention to the bride, do you accept return to the people you once betrayed? Do you swear to use the wisdom gained through exile for the benefit of all, to share the knowledge earned through survival, to honor the mercy that granted you life when death seemed certain? Her voice emerged strong and clear, carrying across the silent gathering like a bell struck in crystal air. I swear by my grandmother's memory and the trials that shaped me that I will serve my people with all the strength I have gained, all the wisdom I have learned, all the love that has grown from ashes of my former foolishness. The ice crown settled onto her head with perfect fit, its crystalline points framing her face like frozen flames. The weight was significant, but not oppressive, balanced carefully to rest securely while allowing natural movement. As the ceremonial headpiece touched her hair, she felt the spiritual weight of acceptance, the restoration of identity that had been stripped away during her exile. Cascais received his own ceremonial marking, a carved bone amulet that designated him as adopted member of the tribe, granted all rights and responsibilities of birth membership. The amulet bore symbols representing his proven skills, hunting, survival, partnership, wisdom. It hung around his neck like a talisman of belonging, transforming him from wandering exile to valued community member in a single ceremonial moment. The assembled tribe burst into celebration as the formal ceremony concluded. Drums appeared from traveling packs, their rhythmic beats echoing across the frozen landscape. Food emerged from carefully guarded stores. Seal meat, dried fish, precious tea saved for special occasions. Despite the harsh environment, the gathering took on the joyous character of summer festivals, proving that human celebration could flourish even in winter's heart. Children who had never seen Nayeli before her exile now approached with shy curiosity, drawn by the ice-crown's sparkling beauty and the stories already growing around her survival. She knelt to their level, sharing tales of igloo construction and ice fishing that transformed her ordeal into adventures worthy of retelling around winter. Fires. Cascais found himself surrounded by hunters, eager to learn techniques he had developed during years of solitary survival. His knowledge of weather patterns, animal behavior, and resource management filled gaps in their collective wisdom, proving that his adoption would benefit everyone rather than strain limited resources. As Aurora began to dance overhead, painting the celebration in supernatural light, Nayeli and Cascais stood together, wearing symbols of their accepted union. The ice crown caught and reflected the sky's shifting colors, creating a nimbus of light that seemed to bless their partnership with celestial approval. The preserved first ice block sat in the place of honor within their new dwelling, its surface still bearing the crude tool marks from those desperate early days. when Nayeli had struggled alone against the killing cold. Now it rested on a shelf carved specifically to hold it, surrounded by the comfortable objects of established life: cooking implements, warm furs, tools worn smooth by regular use, and small treasures that marked a household built on love rather than mere survival. 5 years had passed since that winter of exile and discovery. 5 cycles of seasons that had transformed 2 desperate survivors into pillars of community strength. The ice block served as their private shrine to the journey that had brought them together, a reminder of how far they had traveled from those first tentative moments of trust to this established life of mutual devotion and shared purpose. Nayeli ran her fingers along the block's rough surface, remembering the bone-deep exhaustion that had filled her as she carved it with her grandmother's knife. The woman who had cut this ice seemed like a stranger now, desperate, alone, convinced that survival was the highest goal she could achieve. She could barely imagine that younger self, so focused on merely staying alive that she never dreamed of the rich life that would grow from those brutal beginnings. Their dwelling had grown beyond the original igloo into a complex of interconnected spaces that housed not just themselves, but the overflow of visitors who came seeking their expertise. The fishing techniques they had developed together were now standard practice among 3 different tribes. Their methods for winter construction had reduced cold weather deaths by half in the settlements that adopted them. Knowledge that had grown from desperate necessity now served dozens of families across the vast Arctic territories. Cascais entered carrying their youngest child, 3-year-old Tuki, named for the son he had lost, but now representing renewal rather than replacement. The boy had his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined chin, along with a fearless curiosity that kept both parents constantly alert. He reached toward the preserved ice block with small fingers, understanding instinctively that it held special significance even if its story remained beyond his comprehension. "Tell us the story, Mama," said 7-year-old Siku, settling cross-legged on the floor with the perfect stillness that children reserved for their favorite tales. Her name honored the man Nayeli had been meant to marry, a gesture of respect that had helped heal old wounds while acknowledging how different choices had led to better outcomes for everyone involved. The story had become family tradition, told on winter evenings when wind howled outside their warm shelter, and children needed reminding that difficulties could transform into blessings with enough patience and courage. Nayeli had refined the telling over years of repetition, finding the balance between honest acknowledgement of hardship and hope-filled emphasis on love's power to redeem even the darkest circumstances. "This block was cut when your mother was alone and afraid," she began, her voice taking on the ritual cadence of practiced storytelling. She thought she was building shelter, but she was really building the foundation for everything we have now. This home, this family, this life that seems like a dream compared to those desperate days. Cascais settled beside his wife. Baby Uki nestled in his arms, completing the family circle that surrounded the humble monument to their origins. The newest child carried Nayeli's grandmother's name, ensuring that the wisdom which had enabled survival would continue flowing through future generations who would face their own unique challenges. "The ice remembers," Cascais added softly, his eyes meeting Nayeli's across their children's heads. "It remembers every tool stroke, every desperate prayer, every moment when giving up seemed easier than continuing. But it also remembers the first time your mother realized she was going to survive, going to build something lasting from the wreckage of her former life." Outside their dwelling, the sounds of community life continued, children playing games, adults discussing hunting plans, elders sharing traditional stories with anyone wise enough to listen. The Taktu settlement had grown larger and more prosperous in the years since Nayeli's return, strengthened by the knowledge and partnerships her exile had ultimately produced. The preserved ice block caught the lamplight and threw back gentle reflections, its surface transformed from crude survival tool into symbol of endurance, hope, and the unexpected ways that love could emerge from the coldest, most unlikely circumstances. In its crystalline depths lay the entire story of their journey from isolation to unity, from mere survival to abundant life, from broken exile to foundation stone of family and community. As their children's breathing deepened into sleep and the lamp burned lower, Nayeli and Cascais sat together in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, hearts filled with gratitude for the winter that had tested them individually and forged them into something stronger together. The first ice block watched over them all, guardian of memories that would be passed down through generations of descendants who would build their own shelters, one block at a time, in whatever frozen places the future might demand they call home. Aye.